Namaste, good evening, and good morning, everyone, from wherever you are watching us. I am your moderator for this session, Bibek Dosthapa, Program Coordinator and Research Associate at NICE. So, before we start, I would like to quickly introduce NICE. NICE is an independent, apolitical, and non partisan think tank based in Nepal, which believes in freedom, democracy, and a world free from conflict. I would like to welcome you all to a very special session of our Tech in IR series, where we will be discussing governing AI in a fractured world, democracy, diplomacy, and international institutions. For this special session, we have Gordon Laforce, who is a researcher, writer, and lecturer with expertise in international affairs and global technology policy. He's currently a senior policy analyst at New America, an independent think tank based in Washington, D.C., where he focuses on the governance and geopolitics of AI, among other issues. He's also a visiting faculty at Stanford University's Leadership Academy for Development and at Arizona State University's Thunderbird School of Global Management. He has previously worked in private sector at a predictive analytics startup at the US mission to NATO in Brussels and as a freelance journalist in Southeast Asia. His writing and analysis have appeared in Foreign Affairs, the New York Times, and other publications. He is a term member at the Council on Foreign Relations and was awarded two Fulbright fellowships to Indonesia. He holds a master's degree in international relations from Princeton University. Thank you so much for gracing us with your presence here today, sir. I would like to request you to make your remarks and then we will follow up with question and answer sessions. In the meantime, whatever questions the participants may have, please drop them below in the chat box. I would like to hand over the floor to you.
Vivek, please use the speaker view. You are using a gallery view.
Great. Thank you
Okay,
very
you
much
can
for
go.
that kind. Okay, I'll jump in. Thank you for that kind introduction, Bibek, and it is an honor and a privilege to be here with you all this evening, your time. It's morning for me here on the East Coast of the United States. I want to thank you and thank NICE for hosting me, and I look forward to having a good conversation with you all. So what I'm going to do is share some slides, and I will present for around 20 minutes or so, and then I hope we can have a discussion and some questions and answers about some of the issues that I bring up in this presentation. Okay. So governing AI in a fractured world is the subject that we're talking about today, and I think there are three main things that I want to talk about in this brief presentation. So first, I'll kind of give a overview of some global trends in advanced AI as I see them. We're going to be talking about, the most advanced AI models, the large language models that have become a very important flashpoint in geopolitics and international governance, really since the release of ChatGPT in 2022. Next, I'm going to talk about the international governance around AI and the two trends that have really emerged around it, which I think is a resurgence of geopolitics, as I just mentioned, and then a real emphasis on the importance of sovereignty and how sovereignty plays in to AI. And then third, I'm going to talk about some of the consequences of all this. What does this all mean for the world? And what is kind of going wrong in my view, and what I think could be done to help remedy some of those things. Okay, so when we talk about global trends in AI, what I see as the kind of defining feature of how the landscape is developing is that there are very intense concentrations and divides. AI development and AI use is heavily concentrated both along first and foremost along geographical lines. So this image you can see right here was compiled or produced by the Stanford Human Centered Artificial Intelligence Institute. They release an index every year that gives an overview of the AI landscape. And as you can see, since 2003 to 2004 to 2024, most of the notable AI models, so these are the most powerful and significant large AI models, have been produced by the United States and China. And you see this kind of very intense concentration in the global north overall, and there are very few that come out of the global south. So we see all this also in where data centers are located. So for these large AI models, they're basically three essential components for them. There's the data, there is what is called the compute, which is data centers, processing ability, where the chips and the servers are that enable you to both train and then run the AI models. And then finally, the third component are the models themselves, which are just the algorithms and the actual model. So again, here you can see where the AI data centers are located, heavily concentrated in just a handful of countries and a handful of parts of the world. So this is true also in the supercomputers that power AI. This is some data that was put together recently by some researchers at RAND, which is another think tank in the United States. And you see most of the most powerful computational capability for AI is concentrated in the US, China close second, and then there's a handful of other countries that have some capability. So in addition to this, large geographical divide in, where AI models are actually created, where they are able to be run, where there is financing available also. That's something else we could have talked about, is where investment is going towards AI models. But there's also a very large divide in basically governance of AI and in policy instruments that countries and groupings are adopting to try to get a handle on the technology so that it doesn't, one, produce a lot of harmful risks for a society, and then two, that a society is able to make the best use of AI and harness it for digital transformation, for economic development, for making government more effective. So there was some work that I did with some colleagues in Brazil at an institute, a think tank called the Igarapé Institute, that we did for the G20 in Brazil in 2024, that was focused on documenting this divide in governance between the global north and the global south, especially. And we did a review of all the different AI policy instruments that had been developed, really from 2013 until 2024. These include laws, they include national strategies, they include voluntary commitments, statements of principles. So all the commitments and policy instruments that both countries and then groupings of countries have been creating. And as you can see, there's a heavy concentration of these in the global north relative to the global south. This specifically focuses on just national AI strategies. So countries that have developed a national strategy for AI. And you see that in, most of them are produced by developed countries. Not as much in developing and LDCs. Okay, so that is one big divide and concentration in AI, geographic, especially north to south. The other big divide that's out there is between public institutions and private institutions. Increasingly, AI development, frontier AI development, is being done by private companies. It's by industry, not by as much by academia, not as much by governments, but mostly by private companies. And here you can see the number of notable AI models. Now, pretty much all of them are produced by companies, not by other institutions. Here's a chart that shows in 2024. Again, this is from the group at Stanford. This shows which companies are producing, the most notable AI models in 2024. And you see at the top of the list are the large American tech companies, Google, OpenAI. Then you have Alibaba in China, Apple, Meta, NVIDIA. Notice that the only notable model producers that are not large companies are the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and UC Berkeley. So academia is producing some, but not very many. Similarly, when it comes to AI supercomputer ownership, it's mostly private, not public. And similarly with data centers, the compute for AI, there are a handful of American companies that control, the compute capability, and then a handful of Chinese ones. And this is kind of a novel development in frontier transformational technologies. Previous technologies, such as the internet, such as GPS, these were all developed with a lot of government involvement and investment. AI is kind of different because it's being developed almost entirely by the private sector, with, in the US at least, like very little involvement from the government. Okay, so that's a kind of an overview of the landscape, and this feature of concentration that I see is kind of defining how it's developing. When it comes to governance internationally, early on, and by early on I mean from about 2019 until really last year or the year before that, there was a lot of multilateral activity around AI. So at the UN, you had agreed to last year something called the Global Digital Compact, which was an agreement that covered digital transformation and digital technology generally, but it had a large section on AI, and it had a lot of recommendations and commitments from countries about what they would do with respect to AI, and what safeguards and responsibilities they would uphold to make sure the technology remained safe. There were 3 specific institutions that the UN proposed creating in the Global Digital Compact. One was an observatory, a scientific observatory that could assess the AI landscape and issue recommendations and assessments, something similar to what we have in climate change with the IPCC. The second was the creation of, or the proposal for the creation of, a global fund on AI that could help take AI resources from the global north and share them with the global south, and kind of help marshal financing to help AI development in the global south. And then the third is, I think, what was called the Global Forum on AI, which during the UN General Assembly, on the sidelines of it, there would be a big meeting on AI when countries would get together and talk about AI specifically. In addition to this, the UN General Assembly last year passed a resolution on AI that was sponsored by both the United States and China, that laid out a lot of good principles about the governance of AI and what countries could commit to. You had this effort to create a stronger coalition and commitments around AI safety, an initiative that was launched by the UK. They had a first AI safety summit in the UK, and then there was another one in Korea, and another one in Paris recently. And then even before that, you had UNESCO issuing ethics recommendations. The OECD has worked on principles. All of this has been voluntary, and none of it has been binding. And we kind of saw a shift towards, there was a lot of emphasis on having multilateral activity and a lot of impetus around it. But really, that has dwindled. And at the Paris AI Summit earlier this year, the US Vice President, J.D. Vance, kind of signaled the death knell of this. When he got up and he said the US especially will not be committing to any like safety agreements multilaterally, that the US is going to press ahead with innovation and basically win the AI race. And we'll talk about why that is not a very good framing later, in my opinion. But what I think the upshot here is that the best chances we have for some kind of international AI governance, some kind of multilateral agreement, we're not going to get something that is multilateral and comprehensive around AI governance. The best we might get are some agreements on the military use of AI, especially just between the US and China, on limitations on what will allow AI to do in military engagements, and ensuring that humans stay in the loop in decision making. And then I think we'll probably have some international norms around AI in the same way that we have around cybersecurity, which is to say that these are not very robust. I don't think we'll have a lot of strong governance coming out of the multilateral system with respect to AI. So what that means is that the national approaches of the large AI powers will come to be the de facto international governance for AI, and these are come into conflict with each other. And I think what's very interesting is that there have been shifts in how each of these powers has traditionally governed technology internationally and what their priorities have been. That has been shifting lately with AI. So the United States has long emphasized a very laissez-faire, hands-off approach towards technology globally. So when it was supporting the expansion of the internet and large internet platform companies, as they expanded their operations overseas, the United States was really a champion of open expansion, which was sometimes very harmful. Like the unconstrained activity of large social media companies has produced a lot of harms around the world. What we're seeing now is that the United States has been exercising a lot more control and is trying to restrict the spread of AI technology. It has implemented export controls to try and limit the chips, that the powerful AI chips produced primarily by NVIDIA, to restrict their export to China and other countries. It has doubled down on like an industrial policy where it's investing a lot domestically, and trying to reduce dependency on supply chains. And all of this is enabled because there's a bipartisan narrative in the United States right now that AI is an arms race, especially between the US and China, and that the United States has to do everything it can to win that race and to prevent China from being on the same footing as the United States. Interestingly, China AI. China has typically been very controlling and restrictive of digital technology. It implemented the Great Firewall to basically cut itself off from the global internet and restrict access to it. We've seen with the release of DeepSeek, DeepSeek's powerful R1 model, which came out earlier this year, China has shifted its position and is now trying to propagate its AI models around the world, and is emphasizing that all of its AI models that are created by Chinese companies should be open. They should be open weight, and they should be available everywhere. So where the United States is pursuing this strategy of trying to make sure that its companies produce the most powerful and most innovative models, China's approach is to make sure that its models are being used by as many countries around the world as possible. And it's focusing on really open proliferation, which is a big and interesting change in how these two countries have viewed technology before. In Europe, there's a similar shift that's happening. So Europe has typically relied on its regulatory power and the size of its large common market. There's something called the Brussels effect, which is the idea that emerged after Europe passed the GDPR in 2015 on data protection, that whatever the regulatory structure that Europe puts in place will kind of de facto become regulation in the rest of the world, because companies will just adopt it because they need to access the European market. Europe introduced the most restrictive and comprehensive regulation to AI, the EU AI Act, which has a risk-based framework that puts a lot of restrictions on AI. it has since been kind of backing away from this heavy regulatory approach, and it is now focusing on having to on the need to develop and innovate on its own and develop its own AI capabilities that are specific to Europe, something that it's calling the Euro stack. So this again is a shift. Europe is trying to create more innovation instead of just trying to regulate like it was before. And then in addition, you have all these rising powers from India to Brazil to South Africa that are focused on trying to assert sovereignty. Whereas before they were largely dependent on large tech companies and just whatever technology was available, they're now trying to develop it themselves. And they're really focused on this idea of technological sovereignty. So this has come in AI to be called AI sovereignty, and it's become a really dominant approach and mode of governance in most of the world. It comes out of this idea of digital sovereignty, which is the idea that you as a country should have your own ownership and control over data and your own digital destiny. With AI, this is, you need to control your own data, your compute, create your own AI policy that's specific for your country, and have your own models. There are different motivations behind sovereign AI. Jensen Huang, who is the CEO of NVIDIA, which NVIDIA produces the advanced chips called GPUs that power cutting edge AI models. Jensen has been going around the world saying that every region, every country needs to build their own sovereign AI, presumably using NVIDIA chips. And the logic there is that countries need both autonomy and they need to be able to preserve their own culture and their own identity rather than just be subsumed by a large language model created in the United States or China. Europe has also adopted this focus on AI sovereignty, and it's doing so for national security reasons. This was a report from the European Commission that was released a few days ago in which they said geopolitical shifts are turning the EU's digital supply chain dependencies into strategic vulnerabilities. And I think what they specifically mean is that the United States is no longer a reliable security partner for Europe like it was before. And Europe doesn't want to be dependent on these large US tech companies, which Europe and the tech companies are increasingly opposed to each other. So an overview of what are the benefits of AI sovereignty. I mentioned national security. It gives you, greater protection of your own digital interests. Autonomy, controlling your own digital destiny allows you to focus on your own economic development to create policies better suited for your own country and your own circumstances. And then this argument of localism is very compelling, that if you want to preserve your own culture, it's very important that you have your own large language models. You want to be able to prioritize the needs and the priorities of your own context, not whatever, the large language model from, Europe, the US or China affords. However, there are a lot of downsides to AI sovereignty. One, it emerged and was focused on kind of an authoritarian control over the technology. I mean, the original roots of digital sovereignty came out of China, which was focused on controlling and cutting off. And it's very top down, this idea of AI sovereignty. The government controls it, and there's not a lot of input from the people. It can be balkanizing. So it can splinter the digital landscape, and a lot of the benefits and the gains from the digital economy come because there is interconnection among different countries, and there's been free flow of data and free use of software between countries. And if you start to really put walls up to that, it has negative economic effects and other consequences. And then the biggest argument against this approach to AI sovereignty, I think, is that it's very self-undermining. If you are a smaller country, it's not realistic that you're able to produce your own large language model on your own, which could be incredibly expensive. Data centers are incredibly expensive. There are, the digital divide is still very pronounced. You might not have the capability to be able to produce this. And meanwhile, if you insist on just having your own, capabilities within your own country, then as a country, you'll miss out on a lot of the benefits of this technology, which it can produce a lot of incredible benefits. So overall, the third part, talking about kind of what the consequences are of both these concentrations of power and the different approaches to international AI governance that we're seeing. I think the one dominant thing is in geopolitics, this idea of the arms race that has really taken hold in the United States and is kind of affecting how the United States is viewing AI globally. I think it's one kind of a fantasy that there is, a race implies that there's some kind of finish line that you can get to, and then suddenly you will be dominant and protected forever. And that's just not the case for AI. AI is going to involve a lot of different models. It's going to involve a lot of different companies. It's going to involve a lot of different competitors, and it's constantly going to change and evolve. So the idea that there is something that can be achieved that will then give you security and dominance for all time, I think is silly. And it's also leading to, in my view, a lot of competition that is preventing real international cooperation that can get our hands around some of the very real risks that will emerge and already are emerging from AI, like disinformation, the ability for large language models to persuade populations and destabilize politics, and the ability for the cause of like labor displacement around the world. I think there will be a lot of consequences from AI, and we need international cooperation to monitor these. And the arms race idea doesn't help. Second, especially on these divides that we're seeing in AI, the risk is that we're going to end up with a world of AI haves and have-nots, and the kind of disparities that we already see in the world are just going to get worse. If you are a country that is advanced and has access to cutting-edge AI, you're only going to advance further. Whereas if you have trouble adopting it, you're not going to be able to make gains. So I think some of these divisions might widen, and that will have social and economic consequences for the world. And then I'm really concerned about breakdowns in democratic accountability that might happen because of our failure to properly govern AI. And you see this, I think the fact that companies are in a lot of control of these models and there's not a lot of public input has real consequences. Okay, I'm going to quickly wrap up because I've spoken for too long already, but just a few ideas about what can be done and where we can go with governance. My colleague Akash Kapoor at New America has come up with this idea that we need to move from digital sovereignty to digital agency, which is much more focused on governing AI in the interests of the actual people and the citizens who are using it, and starting with that as the premise. Like, how can AI actually enhance the citizenry? How can it enhance and bring more benefits instead of just being in the hands of governments and large companies? Key to this is stakeholder multiplicity. So collaborations, rather than just turning inward and focusing only on your nation, thinking of like what collaborations can happen at a regional, mini-lateral level. How can resources be pooled to get over some of the capacity constraints? There's one scholar who says you should adopt like a Jenga AI tech stack. Jenga is this game where you have different pieces. You might have played it before. So basically picking and choosing, which pieces you get from which countries or companies, and being just smart about protecting this, creating your own AI policy focused on enhancing the technology, not overly constraining it. In a lot of cases, misuse of technology can be worse than misuse of technology. Like, you really don't want to miss out on AI. It can bring immense benefits. But really just focusing on what the priorities are and having citizen participation in those processes to enable it. And then finally, really focusing on the human capacity, digital literacy, in governments, the ability to make sure everyone in the government knows about AI and is able to engage with it, use the tools as best they can be used. So enhancing human capacity overall. Okay, I'll stop talking. I've talked for too much, but I hope we can have a conversation and look forward to hearing any questions you have.
Thank you, sir. It was a very insightful session. So I would like to start on this question of China. So you brought this very interesting concept of Great Wall to DeepSeek. And I think because of this China's authoritarian approach to AI sovereignty, there are many things that are beyond the scope of DeepSeek when you try to use it. So I wanted to ask, what role does the Chinese government now have in AI development? Could you elaborate on some policy incentives which it is using to collaborate more with the private sector?
Yeah, so I mean, this is a really interesting shift in the Chinese Communist Party's approach to AI. So as you rightly noted, um, China has been very restrictive, especially about the kind of content that an AI model will produce, or that an AI, like a chatbot, for instance, will give you. If you ask, one of the leading Chinese chatbots about Tiananmen Square, for instance, it won't discuss it. So the party has, consistent with how it is about the spread of information, been very restrictive about what chatbots can say and what they can't say. And I think China in the earlier days of AI, which by that again I mean like 2018 to 2023 or so, was not I don't want to say dismissive. They had a very strong AI development investment, and an ecosystem focused on AI development, but they have not been focused on this belief in trying to create artificial general intelligence, which has really captivated the United States companies. And artificial general intelligence just refers to a model that can do any task, any cognitive task better than a human can. China has been more focused on applications and, how can AI be used specifically for improving the functioning of the economy and improving the workforce. Again, so this big shift happened with the release of DeepSeek, where before China wasn't really caught up in trying to race with the US. But then when DeepSeek was released, China began to both invest in the companies a lot more. And by invest, I mean not only see that capital flowed in, but kind of enable them to, be more active and produce more. The oversight of AI moved out of China's cybersecurity regulator, which is focused more on security and censorship, and it moved into the kind of economic affairs and economic development department of the party, such that the focus has been more on, okay, we need to, proliferate these models and we need to spread them. And their approach now is to win in adoption of AI and AI diffusion, not necessarily in, being the first to create some notional artificial general intelligence solution. So again, what's interesting to me about this is that it's quite an inversion where China is now the more open kind of technological player in this. And a lot of the large US companies have been more restricted and more closed in, releasing, most of the large US models are not open weight. Whereas there is now a policy in China that every model must be open weight. So they are trying to make everything open because they want to be the leader in adoption. So it's a very interesting dynamic that's happening.
Thank you, sir. So the next question is related to the USA. I think it was last week or the week before that we saw this creation of Detachment 201, where some executives of AI companies like Meta, Palantir, and OpenAI, they were sworn in as lieutenant colonels of the US Reserve Army. So could you elaborate on what their roles may look like for American military, its national security and defense policy?
So that's a great question. And this is another consequence of both this AI arms race narrative that has taken hold, and also of the posture of the Trump administration with respect to technology companies. The technology companies are increasingly acting like they are appendages of the state. This is another big change. So, American technology companies have always seen themselves as very independent from the government. They have been resistant to taking on defense contracts and working with the government in many cases. Palantir has always been an exception because they were created as a company that worked with the military explicitly. But if you remember, some years ago, there was a large Department of Defense project called Project Maven, which was about developing artificial intelligence capabilities for the Defense Department. And Google was the main company involved in this contract. And there was a revolt among workers at Google. They didn't want to be involved in a project that would be used for military purposes and would result in deaths, presumably. Google's motto has always been do no evil. And the workers at Google revolted against this, and Google abandoned the contract. They stepped out from it. So that was kind of where things were, and that was kind of representative of how US technology companies had viewed working with the defense sector before. Now we have seen a big shift where OpenAI, I believe, just signed there's a $200 million defense contract that they're going to be working on. Scale AI has been working with the US military. More broadly, there has been a stronger alignment between the technology companies and the state. And you saw this at the inauguration of Donald Trump, the second one. And if you watch that, in the second row right behind Donald Trump were the leaders of many of these technology companies. You saw Sundar Pichai from Google. You saw Tim Cook from Apple, Mark Zuckerberg. So there is this stronger alignment between the state and the technology companies. And I think the technology companies are doing it in their own self-interest. I don't know that they necessarily are really committed to the goals of the Trump administration or of the state more broadly, but I think they see the opportunity and the need to do this. So it is another change, another big development in AI.
Thank you, sir. The next question is somewhat related to small states like us, Nepal. So how can smaller or developing countries ensure that they have a voice in global tech diplomacy and AI regulation?
Yeah, it's like a very important and big question. And I think the big thing that I would emphasize is and that I see is starting to be effective is regional collaborations and what they call, mini-lateral collaborations. So pooling together with like-minded countries to have a bigger voice and get a larger seat at the table. Because this is there needs to be a use of, with like the UN becoming less relevant and important in this conversation. I think in asserting voice and interests in governance, it's going to take, some collaboration and working together. And I know forums like ASEAN, like the African Union, but even like at a lower level, different regional collaborations that can help amplify the voice of smaller states. I think it's a very important mechanism to use.
Thank you, sir. The next question would be, so yeah, your observations were around the decay of multilateralism. So along these lines, how can democratic nations ensure that AI governance frameworks uphold human rights and democratic accountability, especially when authoritarian regimes are simultaneously advancing their own norms?
I think it's very important for democratic nations to band together and to agree on principles that they will uphold for responsible use of AI, even knowing that they're not going to be globally adopted. But there needs to be more responsible governance, especially coming out of the United States. That becomes a lot more powerful if you have agreement among Japan, Korea, the European Union, where there are like-minded democratic values, and you know, democratic focused countries in the global South and that are rising as well. So I think there is a real need to strengthen those collaborations. There was some of this that was happening at the G7, something called the Hiroshima process, in which the large G7 countries were agreeing on principles that they said they would uphold for democratic values in AI. So I think there needs to be more of that. And even knowing that there's not going to be, you know, some global agreement that authoritarian countries are not going to agree to those kind of principles and values, I think you need to have this for AI itself to be sustainable. You need to have good governance of it. You need to have safety built into it.
Thank you, sir. I think we're out of time now. We had lots of questions, and I really wanted to keep this going, but since due to the time crunch, we could not. I want to thank you for your times. Thank you so much for agreeing to speak with us. It was an honor, and I also want to thank all the participants to joining us here today for this insightful session. And I hope we can take this dialogue going further in the days to come.
Well, thank you, Vivek. It was an honor and a privilege to be here today with you all and to do this. And thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. We'll be in touch.
Okay, sounds good. Take care, everyone.